Right now, millions of microchips inside your phone, your car, and the server running this video all come from one island, an island that China has vowed to control, by force, if necessary. If that happens, we're not just talking about a regional conflict. We're talking about a war that could reshape global power, crash the world economy, and potentially pull the United States into direct combat with a nuclear-armed superpower. So what actually happens if China attacks Taiwan? To understand why this island of 23 million people sits at the center of global anxiety, you need to know what Taiwan actually is, and why Beijing sees it as unfinished business. Taiwan lies just 100 miles off China's coast. Officially called the Republic of China, it's been self-governed since 1949, when Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces fled there after losing the Chinese Civil War to Mao Zedong's communists. For over 7 decades, Taiwan has functioned as an independent country, its own military, its own elections, its own passport. But here's the problem. China's Communist Party has never accepted this. Beijing considers Taiwan a breakaway province that must eventually reunify with the mainland. And under Xi Jinping, China's most powerful leader since Mao, that timeline is accelerating. Why now? 3 reasons. First, China's military has grown exponentially. It now operates the world's largest navy by ship count. Second, Xi has staked his political legacy on achieving reunification, possibly before 2049, the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic. Third, and this is crucial, that the United States has historically backed Taiwan with arms sales and implicit defense guarantees under the Taiwan Relations Act. But that support has become increasingly uncertain. Most people assume this is just another Cold War-style standoff. But the reality is far more dangerous and far more complicated. On the surface, this looks like classic territorial ambition. China wants Taiwan because it's Chinese territory, right? That's the narrative Beijing promotes. And sure, nationalist pride plays a role. But if you think this is just about reunification or historical grievances, you're missing what's actually driving this conflict. Here's where it gets interesting. Taiwan sits at the geographic choke point of what military strategists call the first island chain, a series of archipelagos stretching from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines and Indonesia. Right now, this chain effectively boxes in China's naval forces. If China controls Taiwan, it breaks through this barrier and gains unobstructed access to the Pacific Ocean. Think about it this way. Imagine your entire navy being trapped in a bathtub, and the only way out is through a narrow drain controlled by your adversaries. That's China's position. Taiwan is the drain. Controlling it means China can project military power across the Pacific, threatening U.S. bases in Guam and Japan, and dominating the South China Sea, through which $3.4 trillion in trade flows annually. The U.S. military knows this. That's why the Pentagon calls Taiwan the cork in the bottle. Lose Taiwan, and American dominance in the Indo-Pacific effectively ends. But here's what makes Taiwan truly irreplaceable: semiconductors. Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and more than 90% of the most advanced chips, the ones that power everything from fighter jets to artificial intelligence systems. Almost all of this comes from one company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC. Apple, Nvidia, Qualcomm, AMD, they all depend on TSMC. If China invades Taiwan and either captures or destroys TSMC's fabrication plants, the global economy doesn't just stumble, it collapses. We're talking about instant shortages of phones, cars, medical devices, and military hardware. The Bloomberg Economics estimated that a conflict over Taiwan could cost the global economy $10 trillion, roughly 10% of global GDP. China knows this. And here's the kicker. Despite massive investment, China still can't manufacture cutting-edge chips domestically. Western sanctions have blocked their access to the machines needed to make them. So China faces a dilemma: fall further behind technologically or seize the source. Let's talk about Xi Jinping. Since taking power in 2012, Xi has centralized authority, eliminated term limits, and cultivated a strongman image. For him, Taiwan isn't just policy, it's personal legacy. In 2019, Xi declared that reunification is inevitable and that China reserves the right to use force. Unlike his predecessors, who were content to wait, and Xi has openly rejected the idea of kicking the Taiwan issue down the road. He's 70 years old. If he wants to be remembered as the leader who reunified China, his window is closing. But there's another factor: domestic politics. China's economy is slowing. Youth unemployment hit 21% in 2023. Property markets are crashing. When authoritarian regimes face internal pressure, they often look outward. A successful Taiwan operation could rally nationalist support and distract from economic pain. So what does an actual attack look like? Military analysts outline several scenarios. The most likely isn't a full-scale amphibious invasion. That's incredibly difficult and risky. Instead, China would probably begin with a quarantine or blockade, cutting off Taiwan's imports of food, fuel, and materials. Taiwan imports 98% of its energy. Within weeks, and the island would be starving and powerless. Next would come cyber attacks, taking down Taiwan's power grid, communications, and financial systems. Then missile strikes on air bases, ports, and military installations. Only after Taiwan is isolated and weakened would amphibious forces land. Here's where it escalates. The United States has defense partnerships with Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. If the U.S. intervenes, and there's strong political pressure to do so, we're looking at direct military confrontation between two nuclear powers. Japan, which hosts 50,000 U.S. troops, would almost certainly be drawn in. Australia, bound by the AUKUS Pact, might follow. You might be wondering, would the U.S. actually fight for Taiwan? Officially, the U.S. maintains strategic ambiguity. It doesn't confirm or deny whether it would defend Taiwan. But President Biden has stated 4 times that the U.S. would intervene before White House aides walked it back. The Taiwan Relations Act commits the U.S. to providing Taiwan with defensive weapons, but not explicitly to defend it militarily. The ambiguity is intentional. It's meant to deter China from attacking while preventing Taiwan from declaring formal independence. But that ambiguity is becoming unsustainable. Let's bring this home. Why does this matter to you? First, the economic shock. Remember the supply chain chaos during COVID? Multiply that by 10. No new iPhones, car factories shutting down, medical equipment shortages. The Federal Reserve estimates a Taiwan conflict could trigger a global recession worse than 2008. Second, military costs. A war over Taiwan would be the most expensive conflict in American history. The U.S. would face massive casualties, potentially thousands of service members. And there's a non-zero chance of nuclear escalation, especially if China feels it's losing. Third, the end of the global order. Since 1945, the United States has guaranteed freedom of navigation and defended democratic allies. If the U.S. fails to protect Taiwan, every treaty ally from NATO to South Korea will question whether American security guarantees mean anything. That uncertainty breeds instability and eventually more wars. Now, some analysts argue that China won't invade because the costs are too high. An invasion could fail militarily. Taiwan's mountainous terrain and well-armed forces make it a fortress, even if successful. But China would inherit a devastated economy and hostile population. Sanctions would cripple China's economy, which still depends on Western markets. Others point out that deterrence is working. China hasn't invaded yet, despite having the capability. Xi might prefer a long-game strategy, slow economic integration, political pressure, and waiting for Taiwan's will to resist to erode over time. And there's this: war isn't inevitable. Diplomacy, economic interdependence, and credible deterrence have prevented conflict for decades. The question is whether those guardrails hold as Xi consolidates power and the US-China rivalry intensifies. But here's the hard truth. The trend lines aren't encouraging. China is building an average of 5 warships for every one the US builds. Its amphibious assault capacity has tripled since 2015. And Taiwan's military is struggling to recruit and modernize. The window for peaceful resolution is narrowing. So here's the bottom line. If China attacks Taiwan, we're not just talking about a regional war. We're talking about a conflict that reshapes global power, crashes the world economy, and tests whether the United States is still willing and able to defend the international order it built. This isn't some distant hypothetical. Military planners in Beijing, Washington, and Tokyo are running simulations right now. The decisions being made today about defense budgets, alliances, and chip manufacturing will determine whether this conflict happens and who wins if it does. The microchips in your hands? They're not just technology. They're the stakes in a struggle for the future of global power. If this changed how you see the US-China rivalry, hit subscribe, because next, we're breaking down China's Belt and Road Initiative and why it's quietly reshaping 3 continents. You won't want to miss it.